chimpanzee. There you go.
Whether I was born this way or my personality was formed by circumstance, I don't think anyone would call me an easy person to deal with. You know, if it doesn't have ambiguity, don't bother to take it. I mean, I love that aspect of photography, the mendacity of photography. It's got to have some kind of peculiarity in it, or it's not interesting to me.
Hi there. I've just finished reading Sally Mann's memoir, Hold Still, and I thought it might be interesting to take a look at her landscapes of the American South. I find the controversy surrounding her images of children a bit petty, so I felt that perhaps her landscape work might be a little less cluttered by criticism. Unfortunately, in my research, I found that some commentators had managed to find something to object to with these photographs as well. She probably draws scrutiny because she's famous and because she's prepared to take on the big themes. Some critics have said that her haunted landscapes are filtered through a white southern perspective, while the New Yorker suggested that instead of focusing on ghosts and hidden presences, she should have addressed the oppressive histories of individuals more directly. It's understood that the American South has had its fair share of darkness, civil wars, slavery, and racial terror. But Mann goes out of her way to confront these issues in a sensitive manner and only from a very personal perspective. As her children began to move on with their lives, she turned her attention to the land. Mann was born and raised in Lexington, Virginia, and has lived much of her life there. For her, the land is not just a backdrop, but part of who she is. Her images of the rural South reveal the physicality of the landscape and include themes of loss, memory, transience, and death. In her memoir, she reveals a family history that's filled with similar themes. Personally, she had to endure the dual suicides of her father and son Emmett, as well as witnessing and photographing her husband's physical decline due to muscular dystrophy. At first, she struggled to settle on a visual language for her landscapes. She wanted to be able to create metaphors that expressed her connection to this land, saturated with deep and dark stories. She began taking pictures on a farm, then in the wider Virginia state, and eventually moved further afield. This shot was taken on her farm at a site that Mann refers to as Dead Boy Hill. She used a large format vintage camera and an old lens that didn't entirely cover the photographic plate, which resulted in the vignetting at the top. The style of this work is reminiscent of the pictorialism that Stieglitz worked so hard to displace. She also tinted the silver gelatin print with tea, giving it an old sepia finish. At some stage, she was asked by the High Museum in Atlanta to participate in a commissioned project called Picturing the South. Although she usually avoids commercial or commissioned work, this assignment fitted into the broader theme of her work, so she accepted.
I have almost no recollection of how it came about, except that I know I said no, because I don't work well under pressure. And then I had this idea that maybe what I should do is take this opportunity to pivot and do some completely new, more challenging work, which is not at all what a curator wants to hear. I mean, they choose you for a reason. They choose you for a certain style of work or a certain body of work. I'm headed down there with film I've never used before in my life and no concept whatsoever of what I was going to do. So I just struck out with that new film and an entirely new aesthetic ambition. Wanting to do something so radically different than what I had been doing. And it would have been a very costly mistake for the High if it had completely failed.
She wanted these images to differ from her Virginia-based photographs, but wasn't exactly sure what approach to take. 20 years earlier, while doing work for Washington and Lee University, she had discovered some glass negatives that were made by photographer Michael Miley. He was known for photographing General Stonewall Jackson during the American Civil War. Miley would print positive images from Collodion wet plate glass negatives. Mann was particularly drawn to the plates that Miley would have definitely thought were failures, the ones that were slightly foggy, solarized, or otherwise unclear. Initially, she mimicked the Collodion process by shooting on orthofilm, but eventually made the shift to wet plates using custom film holders adapted for her 8x10 camera. She also converted her Chevy Suburban into a traveling darkroom, which meant driving about and sometimes even sleeping next to a collection of exotic and explosive chemicals.
I learned how to do this from a master. He's a genius teacher, and he really knows wet plate collodion. His name's Mark Osterman. It's a sort of cranky process. It doesn't allow for much sloppy technique. It's hard to get these chemicals. They're all, controlled. Collodion and ether and, of course, grain alcohol you can get, but you can't get it in Virginia. Then you take it to the silver nitrate.
Ugh, there's a bug in here.
My plates are horribly flawed, but of course it's the flaws I like, so you pray. In your prayer, you pray, please don't let me screw it up, but just screw it up a little bit, just enough to make it interesting.
The collodion process was invented in the 19th century, and it's an exacting process in which one has to begin with a spotlessly clean glass and then expertly apply the chemicals. Mann, on the other hand, was drawn to the technique because of its potential for imperfection. She was happy to allow bits of dust to settle on the glass and also encourages pooling of chemicals or allows other blemishes to come to the fore. In these pictures taken at Antietam for her Battlefield series, the surface markings become part of her communication. The chemical patterns could suggest fire or smoke. And in this picture, the light spots across the image look like bullet holes. This image, taken at the site of the Cold Harbor battle, has short, fading lines streaking across the image. In this case, they seem to imitate flying bullets. The chaotic darkness of her images draws us as viewers back into the horror of battle. While photographing at the site of the Antietam battle, she watched tourists pile out of a tour bus and walk towards the fairly ordinary-looking field. She wondered whether the extent of death and nightmarish emotions attached to the battle had the power to transform this landscape. In her photographs, the ghosts and the scars of this time reappear. She's aware that Southerners are predisposed to romanticism, sentimentality, and even mysticism. It stems from the idea that the surroundings are alive with the past. Her goal is to capture the stories of these ghosts metaphorically. In the process of producing this work, she is also attempting to reconcile her love for and sense of belonging to the South with its painful history. In one series of photos, she makes a sort of memorial to the murdered Emmett Till. He was just 14 years old when he was abducted and lynched in Mississippi in 1955, after being accused of being offensive to a white woman. Mann traced the sites of his last hours along the Tallahatchie River. In 1,000 Crossings, she paid homage to Virginia Gigi Carter, who made a significant impact on her childhood and adolescence. Carter worked for Mann's family for nearly 50 years.
My parents were important, but Virginia may have been the single most important person
in my life. She's an extraordinary woman. She was my family. Virginia Carter was born right down the road and lived in a black community of freed slaves called Buck Hill, and married very young and had 5 children. And remarkably, with what she earned, sent all 5 children away to boarding school. And then she sent every one of them through college.
Here she sits with Mann's youngest daughter, who was named after the older woman. Carter, the granddaughter of a former slave, provided Mann with unconditional love at a time when her biological mother was largely emotionally absent. A Thousand Crossings again explores the concept of land and memory, and in her photographs of Carter, one becomes aware of the woman's strength and immense physicality. Mann says that since her early childhood, she's been fascinated with Carter's size 13 feet. In this shot, the 2 Virginias fall, the 2 are napping, and their hands become pronounced, especially Carter's painful-looking arthritic joints. Memory and the passage of time are central themes in Mann's landscape photography. She's communicating through metaphors, both a personal and cultural sense of history. She manages to achieve an ethereal look to her images by being innovative with the Collodion process, but also by often using long exposures which allow for movement and blurring. Every now and again I can see vague similarities with her work and lomography, but hers are achieved by means of a highly sophisticated process. Her pictures reveal a sense of the fragility of the land, but also of the people who pass through the cycles of life and death. It's as if the land she photographed has been stained by time and grief. Mann has a strong Welsh branch running through her family tree, which has probably contributed to her continual search for beauty, often tinged with a measure of sadness and melancholy. I'll end with some more of Mann's images of southern landscapes, accompanied by her reading excerpts from her memoir, Hold Still. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
The Suburban was packed to the headliner with coolers of film, smaller coolers with food and booze, nearly identical cylinders of sleeping, film changing, and tent bags, the lunchbox-sized primitive cell phone that Larry insisted I take, folders with heavily annotated maps, and in the far back, the darkroom with stacks of frame-quality glass, silver-blackened trays, and explosive, burping bottles of ether-based chemicals. I stopped whenever I saw something that felt like a photograph or held some mystery or happened to catch the light in an alluring way. My friend Neil Mackenzie, with his Canadian perspective, notes that we Southern artists also display a conspicuous willingness to use doses of romance that would be fatal to anyone else. He likens us to the religious traditionalists of the Appalachians who handle venomous snakes without fear. What snake venom is to them, romance is to the Southern artist. A terrible risk, but also a ticket to transcendence. I have forgotten the many suppers of saltine crackers washed down with iceless gin. No, instead, all that I remember is the rare, heart-pounding, brake-squealing lurch to the verge after glimpsing a potential image. My memories are of those euphoric moments of visual revelation. Tightly woven in the tapestry are the images I made, themselves informed by the inextricable past and its companions, loss, time, and love.